Hey everyone, this is Darshan, and this is our last podcast of 2020 because it's been a very slow year, not much has happened. So we thought we'd take this opportunity and see if we can add some flavor. And we have our usual guest, Nirpal Virdee, but Nirpal had some ideas. So Nirpal, welcome. Tell us more about how you've been and what we're doing today.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
So I'm Nirpal. I head up transparency and disclosure at Satara. So I really head up the efforts around our commercial efforts as well as the subject matter expertise. We've been collaborating a lot over the many years, but quite a lot of new stuff that we'll be doing this year, right? One of the topics we wanted to really explore was a collaboration that we've been working through quite successfully on, intellectual property and how we manage that within transparency. So we're going to have a bit of fun. This is the last part. I'm very privileged that you've invited me for the last one of the year. So we're going to have a bit of fun. So I thought, hey, listen, let me put you on the spot for a change and let me be the interviewer and I will ask you questions. And we'll have a bit of a banter and see how that goes. What do you think?
I think this is going to be fun. I am ready to be put on the spot. So this should be interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it'll be my first time to be on this side of the chair, all the way from the UK. Hey, how's that? All right. So, Darshan, obviously we've been, sort of collaborating together around intellectual property and how we manage that within transparency on behalf of our sponsors. It's been a really challenging area because I think what we found is sponsors have tried to work out how they manage this within the regulations of transparency and putting out data and information and reports. But, there wasn't that much sort of support they were getting until we sort of tried to work out a novel way of doing this. So why don't you start off with telling us a little bit more about intellectual property, around company confidential information, or company business information, depending on which side of the pond you're on.
Yeah. Let's sort of start from the beginning. One of the things we're dealing with is in the context of transparency. What you've got to figure out is, okay, we've got a situation where different health authorities are now expecting us to share data. And as we try to share data, one of the big things they expect us to do is, us being the pharmaceutical industry, is take the information and put it and make it available so that individuals can look at the data and go, well, what does this actually mean? Can I trust the data? Can I use this data to actually make decisions? So one angle is just, can I use this data to make information, to use the information? But you've obviously got competitors, and competitors are coming in and going, wait a second, I have access to this information as well. Can I sort of worry about this data and use it to improve my own product that might be coming onto the market? So as companies are starting to do that, they're starting to think about, okay, what if I am a company that has to disclose the information, how can I make information available at a transparent basis in a way that is fully transparent and yet keep information confidential? So that information that EMA, Health Canada allow you to redact, allow you to make unavailable so that you're comfortable making the rest of the information available is known as CBI or CCI, which is company confidential information or confidential business information, depending on which side of the pond you're on. And the exciting part about that is that you have to, this is a great time to be a patient, because in the end, we're working towards this patient centricity movement. We're trying to work in a way that patients can trust us. But the problem associated with that is we've got situations where sometimes the information comes out and it doesn't bear out in reality once you expose it to a lot more people. A really good example of that, as you may be aware, was COVID. And we had the studies from, I think it was AstraZeneca and Oxford. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nirpal. I could have the companies mixed up. But my recollection is that someone looked at the data and said, wait a second, let's double check this. And they said, oh, turns out we made a mistake. And that is right. And that is exactly what we're hoping for as we continue, which is companies can be held responsible for what they put out. And they went back, and turns out the data had some issues, but overall it didn't actually affect the results. But the good news was that it builds trust to say, we're going to put the information out. We want you to look at this information. But at the same time, how do we make sure that we're controlling these trade secrets? And that's really what the key piece is. In the US, you are allowed, depending on each, there's something called the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, which is at the federal level, but each state also has their own version of it, which is, again, a way of protecting your information. And the goal is, depending on the steps you take, the different states will allow you to keep certain information out of the public eye. And this is just another way to control that data, to control the sharing of that information. Does that make sense? Yeah. Are there any questions?
I think so, and I think hopefully that clarifies sort of in what context we're talking about this company confidential information. But let's explore a little bit about this trust angle. So tell me a little bit more about the link between transparency and trust, and what the regulators have been trying to drive when it comes to how we've been trying to support companies with making some of these very tough decisions about disclosure or battling disclosure of some of their IP.
So I think trust is something that occurs both ways. And it's difficult to say, you know what, we're going to land up in a situation where we want patients to trust us. We also have to depend that we can trust people when we give that information out. So there are two levels of information that has to be controlled. One is the information about the patients, and one is the information about the company itself. So those are the two levels of information that may be redacted. One is PHI, is what would typically be known as, So it's anything that can identify the patient. And then there's the CCI or CBI. And as a company, you want to make sure that you are redacting for the PHI, making sure that an individual patient's information is redacted so you can't identify the patient. But you also want to believe that the information associated with your company, the trade secrets, if you will, your company confidential information, if you will, is also being redacted. Now, how does that all come together? From a trust perspective, what you have to make sure is you address this bilateral trust issue, so that patients, when they look at this information, can go, I believe this information because I have access to this information. And depending on, I know, Nirpal, you and I have actually worked through some situations where both individuals within universities and just third parties can actually get access to the raw data from companies and play with that data in a way that they can go, okay, do I believe this data and why? On the other hand, you also have a scenario where you're enabling just large swaths. Sorry, my dog here keeps trying to come in and say hello.
Always happens.
Always when you're recording.
That's right.
So the interesting thing is that when you're trying to develop that trust, you've got to make sure that you are not only redacting for the PHI, but you're also redacting for the CBI, CCI in a way that's compliant with your with the trade secret laws that may be applicable not just in the US but globally. And those trade secret laws often differ, and the reading and understanding of those laws differs not only at a country by country basis, but also in a state by state basis. So when you're working with companies, what you've got to make sure is that you understand their take and have a clear understanding of what they consider CBI and CCI and what's been put out and what's not. And that is going to build trust for the companies to enable them to say, I'm feeling comfortable putting out this information. And in the same way, enabling individuals to say, I believe the information that is coming out. So that's the interplay of trust between patients and the pharmaceutical industry right now. In the larger scheme of things, that's going to land up having other repercussions, because if you can build that trust, you're really going to start working towards a patient-centric engagement. And that patient-centric engagement is going to be quite useful, I think, because that's where the world is going. That's where the life sciences industries really need to understand and engage.
Okay, let me stop you for a second, because I'm sure we'll get onto that in a little bit more detail, and especially around sort of what sponsors are considering. But how do you think the regulators have played in this space? Do you feel they've been sort of real custodians of the patient, if you like, to try and get this data out? How do you feel the regulator has balanced their perspective on, the disclosure of, the company's the confidential information? So, what's your thoughts on that?
So, I think each country is doing it differently. I think that for the most part, the EU and Health Canada have rules in place on how they're going to put out the information. We've actually had scenarios, however, where the US FDA puts out information before the companies even know that the information is going out. And that information is now being held against a redaction report that's being put out into Health Canada or the EMA. And that obviously is hugely problematic. Then you've got to make sure that you can justify, because this is actually a real concern that pops up. You'll have different agencies say, well, you've disclosed it here. Why can't you disclose it to us or to our patients? And you're sort of left going, well, we didn't intend to disclose it there. Then you've got to remember
that's a really important point there, right, Darshan? Because we live in a global world right now, and we have all of these different regulators that are coming up with their specifications of what they want to have published. But you have this challenge where sponsors have to think about all of the different disclosures globally, because what they disclose in one place, the world is a big wide place. Patients, healthcare practitioners, others all have access to that same data, whether you publish it in one region or another, right?
Exactly right, and that's the question, right? So you've got to go back and be checking your resources, and this is again a place where Certara can help, where we can keep track of what information about your company is being disclosed in other locations, so that'll enable you to go, what can I redact in this location? And that may not be something that happens as a one-off. It may be something that has to happen over and over and over again, because it's not like an agency goes out and says, okay, I'm going to disclose stuff today, and that's all we're going to disclose. We've had situations where the information gets disclosed. You now work with the assumption that everything is disclosed. You now look at another jurisdiction and they go, oh, here's another tranche of information that just came out. And you're like, oh, I didn't even know about that. So that obviously becomes a issue that needs to be considered. The other part of this whole process is we're thinking from a transparency perspective. We're thinking from a CCI, CBI perspective. When you go into that whole intellectual property thought process, intellectual property lawyers don't even know that this thing's happening. So there's an educational curve that applies when you're working with intellectual property attorneys, because they're going, well, here's what I use when I consider whether something is subject to the trade secret laws. And you go, well, that's great. However, this other agency, which you have no engagement with, looks at this whole process very differently. So that educational comes in.
Yeah, well, let's go into that a little bit. Let's go into that a little bit because let's think about the sponsor's perspective then. So, how have you seen that play out? I mean, have sponsors all been the same in terms of how they consider CBI and work through that process, or have you found during our engagements that actually sponsors have a different perspective on what they feel they're comfortable with disclosing? Have you seen big differences?
They're very uniform. Everything's perfect. It's so simple.
Yeah, and the world is rosy.
Exactly. Now, the reality is different. Each company, each individual has their own sensitivity. And the implication of that is you're going to have individuals who go in and say, you know what, I want this information to not be disclosed because I'm not aware of it being disclosed previously. Now that someone else will come out and go, well, we already disclosed this. And the first person might go, well, let's try it anyways. And that's a battle we've had to fight more than once. Another situation we've had is someone coming in and going, this information, we've published a part of this information and that supports our label, but this information never went out and it doesn't support our label. Do we have to provide this information? And again, that's where you have to start making judgment calls. How much of it was necessary to support the label? Is it going to be used for future information? And on what basis can you tell Health Canada or EMA that the redaction is necessary? And that pushback and that engagement. You'll also get companies who take a more aggressive stance and they just redact wholesale and hope that the agency will allow you to do that type of wholesale redaction. In the experiences we've had very few wholesale redactions that have been allowed. However, one of the original thought processes was that you're going to be only able to redact very small things. And it's really how you engage with the agency that enables you to make a argument saying that, look, we need a little bit more than what you guys would normally allow us to redact. And here's why, and here's some things to consider. So, so for me, going back to the question asked, I think it's back to different organizations have different comfort levels as an organization. Then you have different comfort levels within each person, each department, and as a department as a whole. So every company is looking at it differently, and almost every submission, we've had multiple submissions from the same company, and they will look at the same issue very differently the second time around. Obviously, the education helped. So it's more of a refined discussion this time around.
Yeah, and I think, some of the observations that I've seen is, there's a lot of dynamics around, what the sponsor organizations specialize in, the different therapy areas. Yeah. And, those have a real bearing on the company's perspective on how open they are to disclosure. So, what we've seen with, some of our rare disease partners is, they're much more flexible, much more open about just trying to get data out there. And, I think that's in tune with the type of patients they're dealing with, who also are expecting to have and suck as much information as they can and are great researchers compared to other types of patients. And then you have other areas in which, you really do get a lot of protectionism, a lot of thought process about how do we withhold information rather than, trying to put things out.
I agree 100%. I think that in rare disease patients, one of the big advantages you have is you have fewer competitors coming in. So you're less worried about, is my data going to be stolen? Having said that, you still have competitors, and we've had that situation. But your impetus is, let me engage with the patient to make sure that their needs are being met. On the other hand, when you have someone who has a multi-billion-dollar drug coming out, and they know that they have 4 competitors right behind them, and anything you put out is going to be searched, is going to be crawled, so that there is better information available to the next person coming in, that becomes a huge issue for, let's say, the next diabetes therapy. And therefore, that perspective obviously skews what information will be allowed, what information they will allow to be redacted and not, and what type of aggressive discussion. We've had situations where these discussions took literally weeks, and then we've had discussions where these things took months. That's obviously problematic as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let me stop you there. We've only got a few minutes to go. But what I did want to end with is just discussing a little bit about the pain points that, we put this, sort of practice in place, haven't we? Because, we've had a unique ability to partner in which we're offering a regulatory a legal aspect to what we can provide insight on, as well as some novel technology. Tell me a little bit more about the pain points, and then maybe some of the 5 top things to consider, the topics that you would work through when you are when we are collaborating and supporting this CCI CBI process.
I think the way you start off with is by coming in with a very clear plan and very clear timelines. And we've had situations where this keeps dropping in. We've had organizations that are rapidly growing, so the timelines, they're focusing on other things, which makes sense 100%. However, that affects the timeline you have to actually do the redactions on one piece of the project, and as it relates to the redactions and what's allowed under CBI and not. You also have to make so number 1 is have a clear plan and timelines. Number 2 is make sure you have the right decision makers at the table. We talked about this a little bit ago when we talked about how different decision makers will see the situation differently. And instead of having redactions happen, then go to the next decision maker who rethinks the decision, and you have to go back to the drawing board over and over and over again, you get to use this opportunity to go, look, do we have all the right decision makers at the table, and make a decision right there. Have a very clear, so number 2 is have the right decision makers. Number 3, have a clear cutoff. And what I mean by that is, from a timeline perspective, if you say that you're going to allow redactions till, or changes to the rules till, say, next week, you want to hold them to that next week timeline. Because more often than not, people will come in with new ideas, with new perspectives. And we're not saying that those perspectives are wrong. They just land up delaying your timeline, and that may be problematic because you're working with a fixed timeline. So have a very clear cutoff. Number 4 is identify keywords and also context. So one of the ways we work in doing the CBI CCI redactions is that you make sure that you start with a bunch of keywords, but you often want those keywords to have context. For example, if we use the term dry milling, are we talking about things that impact dry milling? Are we thinking that something that that results from dry milling, or is it something completely different? Is it a temperature associated with it? Is it associated with it? Like whatever it is, we need to have very clear context, which will enable a faster review. And then lastly, it's a constant give and take of information and engagement with between the provider, such as us, with the sponsor, with the agency. So if there are any delays, the agency understands why you are why you're stuck with something, and you're going to get back to them very clearly and very quickly. So those would be our top 5. And let me put them again. Explain the plan and timelines, get the right decision makers to the table, have a clear cutoff, identify keyword, but also the context, and lastly, have constant communications.
No, that's fantastic. That's a great insight as to how we work through some of these challenges, because it's been a daunting process, and I'm sort of really chuffed that we were able to sort of work through these pain points. And we were working with sponsors for many years now, and what we were hearing was, hey, listen, I know you guys provide us great advice, a great support when it comes to putting this overall package together and processing it. But we're a little bit lost around the IP and the CBI, CCI aspects of this. We want a lot more hands-on support, please. And I think that's where we've really tried to work through. Okay, how do we get the right type of dynamics together, the right type of resources that, like yourself, have those different dimensions that we can pull on, and provide that rigor so that we can sort of guide organizations through it. And I think it's been great success so far this year. We've got through some key challenges, and it's a real challenge working with sponsors who really need to understand that, you can't sort of put a whole load of things out there thinking that, hey, listen, I'm going to put it out there and just let the regulator come back and push back on me. Really, when you've got fixed timelines, that really is a difficult position to take.
So let me add, so I just noticed some questions from people. So Kevin, thank you again for listening in. David reached out and he actually had a question. Darshan, do regulators actually have patients' best interests in mind or are there other motivations?
Mhm.
Now, I like to believe that regulators do work with patients' best interests in mind. Obviously, what that means seems to change over time, and whether you're looking at HIPAA or you're looking at CBI, CCI redactions, all of which would be true. But I think overall, they are coming at it from a patient-centric viewpoint. We're also evolving in that we don't fully understand what patients want, because we talk to patients on a regular basis. We ask them what they want, and transparency will be a part of that solution, but not all of it. So I think there is obviously a patient's best interest standard, but another standard to consider as well, David, is the fact that they are regulatory required. So they have their own requirements, as you know, that they have to follow. So EMA basically comes out and says that here is what we will accept. You are legally required to follow in terms of what is allowed to be redacted and what's not. So something else to consider as well. So what are they beholden to? What standards are they expected to follow? Nirpal, would you think I missed anything?
No, and I think, the regulators have taken slightly different positions. I think, for example, a lot of the Health Canada work that we've been collaborating on, there is that, sort of engagement. They will push back on you. If there's no economic value that they can clearly see, or if you partially put that information out, they are going to absolutely get you on that, for you to consider. So there are slightly different positions, but ultimately the sponsor, owns that, and will get their way with, that negotiation to get that information out. So there is slightly different criteria, though. I know all regulators seem to be taking their position of the patients, that we want to try and put out as much of this information in a way that can be dissected and analyzed and understood as we can, and have that data utility. And I think that's been the key challenge. But hey, listen, we're really coming up on time. We've probably gone a little bit over what we do. I was going to ask you around how you see things moving in 2021 with these challenges of, CBI, CCI, with the transparency movement. I'm not sure whether we've got time to answer that, or whether we should save that for maybe a future topic.
Sounds like a good topic to have another conversation with, because I do think that tying that into privacy will become a really important aspect. In the US, the regulators put out some information around what they expect from privacy, and they changed the requirements. And I'm going to be doing a podcast around that in terms of just how the privacy requirements impact the life sciences life sciences organizations. But obviously that will have its impact on transparency as well. Short version, expect changes. Even shorter version, from a European standpoint, big changes because Europe will start going online, and Canadian version, not too many changes. US version, big changes. So let's see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Hey, listen, it's been great fun being on the other side. I hope you felt comfortable with answering questions rather than being the person.
It's different being on this side.
It's been a bit of fun. It's been great fun.
Thank you again. Thanks, Nirpal.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks, or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.